The maintenance report lists 21 separate 20mm cannon strikes. 21. Somebody at Halesworth walked around this Republic P-47 Thunderbolt with a grease pencil and a clipboard, marking each entry hole, each exit hole, each gouge where an explosive round detonated against the airframe. And when they finished with the cannon damage, they started on the machine gun hits. They stopped counting at 100, not because they ran out of holes, because they ran out of patience. The crew chief's recommendation, according to the squadron records, came down to a single word: salvage. Strip the engine, pull the instruments, drag the rest to the boneyard. This airplane, by every measure that mattered to the men who kept fighters flying, had died. Except it hadn't, because somebody flew it home. If that hit's different than most things on this channel, good. Hit like, leave a comment telling me what plane you think took the most punishment in the war, and subscribe so the next one finds you. Send the link to someone who thinks fighters were fragile little things. They need to see this. The airfield at Halesworth, Station 365, home of the 56th Fighter Group, the outfit they called Zemke's Wolfpack, sat in Suffolk, about 100 miles northeast of London. By mid-1944, the 56th had already built a reputation as the highest-scoring American fighter group in the 8th Air Force, and they did it flying an airplane that half the Army Air Forces considered a second-choice machine. The P-47 was not what most pursuit pilots wanted: too heavy, too fat. A 7-ton monster with a radial engine the size of a barrel and a turning radius that invited mockery from anyone who had ever sat in a Spitfire. Pilots transitioning from the P-40 or the P-39 looked at the Thunderbolt and asked how they were supposed to dogfight in something that weighed more than some medium bombers. The answer, which took about 6 months of combat to prove, turned out to be simple: stop trying to dogfight, dive, shoot, leave, and when things went wrong, when the Focke-Wulfs caught you level, when the flak found you low, when the Messerschmitt's 20mm cannons walked across your wing route, survive. Come home with pieces missing. Come home trailing oil and hydraulic fluid and smoke. Come home on 7 cylinders out of 18 because the Pratt Whitney R-2800 had cylinders to spare. That's what makes this particular wreck report something more than a maintenance curiosity. 21 cannon hits should have killed the pilot 3 times over. A single 20mm mine shell from a Mauser MG-151 carried 11 grams of high explosive, enough to blow a hole the size of a dinner plate in aluminum skin. 21 of those rounds, striking a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt Bf-109, would have produced confetti. The airframe would have come apart in flight, shedding control surfaces and fuel and pilot in a long smear across the French countryside. The P-47 absorbed it, not gracefully, not without consequence. The control cables frayed to single strands. The hydraulic system bled out completely, which meant no brakes on landing, a detail the pilot dealt with by ground looping into the grass at the edge of the runway. One cannon round penetrated the cockpit floor and exited through the canopy rail, passing through the space where the pilot's left elbow had been a half-second earlier. The records don't say whether he knew how close that one came. Probably not in the moment. Probably later, standing on the hard stand, looking at the hole, to understand why this airplane could do what no other single-engine fighter in the European theater could reliably do: absorb punishment that would have been fatal to any contemporary design, and still deliver its pilot back to English soil. The answer runs deeper than armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks, though both mattered enormously. The real answer sits in a design philosophy that Republic Aviation baked into the Thunderbolt from its earliest drawings in 1940. The assumption that this aircraft would get hit, that getting hit was not a failure of tactics but an inevitability of the mission, and that the engineering had to account for it from pound one. The Luftwaffe figured this out the hard way. Their gun camera footage shows P-47s absorbing hits that should have produced kills, rounds striking, smoke trailing, pieces flying free, and the American fighter continuing to fly. The frustration in the after-action reports is palpable. They hit it, they kept hitting it, and it would not come down. Farmingdale, Long Island, 40 miles east of Manhattan, flat enough to land on and close enough to the docks that raw aluminum could arrive by truck the same day it came off the freighter. Republic Aviation's factory complex sprawled across the north side of the airfield there, a collection of hangars and assembly buildings that by 1943 employed over 20,000 workers, turning out P-47s at a rate that would have struck any pre-war aviation executive as clinically insane. But the man who shaped what those workers built, the chief designer whose fingerprints marked every structural decision in the Thunderbolt's airframe, had never been interested in what seemed reasonable. Alexander Kartveli, born in Tbilisi, educated in Paris, hired by Alexander de Seversky in the early 30s, thought about fighter aircraft the way a bridge engineer thinks about load margins. Everything breaks. The question is when, and how much remains functional after it does. Kartveli's obsession, and obsession is the right word, because the engineering choices he made consistently sacrificed performance metrics that other designers treated as sacred, centered on a single principle: no single point of failure should kill this airplane. Look at the decisions, and they form a pattern so deliberate it borders on paranoid. The fuel system ran through 8 self-sealing tanks distributed across the fuselage and wings, each one wrapped in layers of rubber compound that swelled on contact with gasoline to plug bullet holes. Lose 1 tank, lose 2, lose 4. The engine still drank from the survivors. The oil system carried a staggering 26.5 gallons, roughly triple what a Merlin-powered fighter needed, because Kartveli assumed oil lines would get cut, and the engine would have to run on whatever hadn't leaked out by the time the pilot crossed the English coast. The hydraulic system backed itself up with manual cable reversion for every critical control surface. Shoot out the hydraulics entirely, and the pilot still had mechanical linkage to the elevator and rudder, the ailerons and trim tabs. Degraded, heavy on the stick, but functional. Then there's the engine placement, and this is where Kartveli's thinking diverges most sharply from every liquid-cooled fighter design of the era. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp sat in the nose behind a ring of armor plate, its 18 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows, and a radial engine is, by its geometry, its own armor. A cannon round striking a V-12 like the Rolls-Royce Merlin or the Daimler-Benz DB605 hits a single vulnerable block of coolant jackets, timing gears, reduction drives, and cam housings. Puncture the coolant system, and the engine seizes within minutes, sometimes seconds. A cannon round striking an R-2800 hits 1 cylinder, maybe 2. The other 16 keep firing. No coolant to leak because there is no coolant. The engine is air-cooled, rejecting heat directly through its cylinder fins into the slipstream. Kartveli positioned the turbocharger underneath the cockpit floor, ran the exhaust ducting along the belly of the fuselage, and wrapped the whole assembly in structural members that doubled as fragment catchers. The belly duct looked like a vulnerability. It functioned as a shield. This drove the weight up enormously. The P-47D model tipped the scales at 9,900 pounds empty, roughly 2,000 pounds heavier than a Bf-109G, nearly 3,000 more than a Spitfire Mark IX. Aviation publications in Britain made sport of the numbers, and fighter pilots who hadn't flown, one assumed the weight meant sluggishness. In a flat-turning fight at 15,000 feet, they weren't wrong. But Kartveli hadn't built a turning fighter. He'd built a flying safe. The armor plate behind the pilot's seat ran to half-inch steel backed by 3/8-inch duraluminum. The windscreen was bullet-resistant glass, rated to stop a 7.92 millimeter round at 200 yards. The cockpit tub formed an armored bathtub that wrapped around the pilot from the firewall to the seatback, leaving only the canopy sides as true vulnerability. And even those sat behind structural longerons that could absorb fragmentation. Republic's own engineering summaries from 1942 used language that no other American fighter manufacturer matched. The word they kept returning to, across hundreds of pages of structural analysis and failure mode documentation, is survivable. Not fast, not maneuverable, not climb rate, not ceiling. Survivable. The Luftwaffe pilots pulling their triggers over France and the Low Countries in 1944 had no access to those documents. They didn't need them. The evidence arrived in real time. Tracers connecting, impacts flashing, smoke pouring from wounds that should have been mortal, pieces of cowling ripping free, and the Thunderbolt boring on through the sky ahead of them, refusing the courtesy of falling apart. Cylinder number 14 on the Halesworth Thunderbolt had a 20mm entry hole clean through the rocker box cover. The round punched in from the 7 o'clock position, shattered the intake valve assembly, blew fragments of the pushrod tube into the cylinder barrel, and exited through the cooling fins on the opposite side, taking a chunk of fin material the size of a playing card with it. Cylinder 14 stopped contributing power somewhere over the Pas de Calais. The R-2800 didn't care. 17 cylinders kept turning the propeller shaft at 2,700 RPM, feeding exhaust gases down through the belly duct to the General Electric turbo supercharger, maintaining manifold pressure within parameters that Pratt Whitney's engineers in East Hartford would have considered, if not normal, then at least anticipated. They had tested for this, not theoretically, physically. During the engine's qualification trials in 1941, Pratt & Whitney deliberately disabled individual cylinders, then pairs, then clusters of 3, measuring power output degradation at each stage. The R-2800 produced 2,000 horsepower at full song. Kill 3 cylinders, and it still generated over 1,500. Kill 5, and the pilot had roughly 1,000 horses pulling, enough to maintain level flight at reduced speed, enough to cross the channel and reach the grass at Halesworth and ground loop to a stop. The thermal experience of flying behind a wounded radial defied anything a liquid-cooled fighter pilot understood. A Merlin losing coolant announced itself with a temperature spike so violent the gauges pegged within 90 seconds. The cockpit filled with glycol vapor, sweet and choking, and the engine note changed from smooth to ragged, to seizure in a time frame that left almost no decision space. Bail out or write it down. The R-2800 losing a cylinder announced itself with a vibration. A hard, asymmetric shudder transmitted through the engine mounts into the firewall, up through the rudder pedals into the pilot's boots, resonating in the stick grip until the pilot's fingers tingled. Unpleasant, alarming if unexpected. But the gauges told a different story than the body. Oil pressure holding, cylinder head temperatures on the surviving pots staying within limits, manifold pressure responding to throttle input. The airplane shook. It kept flying, something that irritates me more than it probably should. Luftwaffe intelligence assessments from the Technisches Amt, the technical office responsible for evaluating Allied aircraft, consistently mischaracterized the R-2800's survivability as a function of crude American over-engineering rather than deliberate design sophistication. A captured assessment from late 1943 describes the Thunderbolt's engine as a brute force solution, lacking the precision of German power plant design. The document praises the DB605's specific fuel consumption and power-to-weight ratio, while dismissing the R-2800's bulk as evidence of an industrial culture that substituted mass for finesse. The author, his name is redacted in the declassified version, apparently never considered that the mass was the finesse. That 18 separate cylinders, each machined from individual forgings with independent valve trains, each drawing from a common crankcase but otherwise functioning as a self-contained combustion unit, represented a manufacturing and engineering commitment that Daimler-Benz could not have replicated even if they'd wanted to. Each cylinder on the R-2800 weighed about 42 pounds. Each one could be removed and replaced in the field by a crew chief with a torque wrench and a Sunday afternoon. Try that with a Merlin cylinder block. Anyway, the contrast between the two cooling philosophies determined which pilots walked away from damage and which didn't, with the consistency that the statistical branches on both sides tracked but only the Americans fully leveraged. The 8th Air Force's Operational Research Section compiled loss data throughout 1944, comparing attrition rates between P-47 groups and P-51 groups flying comparable mission profiles, escort to the same target areas, same Luftwaffe opposition density, same flak corridors. The P-51 Mustang, powered by the Packard V-1650, The American-built Merlin performed magnificently in every flight parameter that mattered before the shooting started. Faster at altitude, longer legs, better visibility, superior roll rate. And then the 20mm rounds arrived, and the Mustang's coolant system became a countdown timer. One puncture in the glycol loop, and the pilot had between 2 and 5 minutes of engine life remaining. The P-47 had no such timer. It bled oil, shed cylinder fins, trailed smoke from ruptured exhaust stacks, blew gaskets from warped head surfaces, and the engine kept converting avgas into thrust with whatever hardware remained intact around the crankshaft. Beaumont-le-Roger, Normandy, a grass strip tucked between orchards and hedgerows, home to Jagdgeschwader II, the Richthofen wing. Oberstleutnant Egon Mayer commanded this unit from a farmhouse office where the walls still smelled of cattle. And from this unpromising headquarters, he had solved a problem that every other Luftwaffe fighter leader in the West considered unsolvable: how to kill a B-17. The answer arrived in late 1942, born from geometry rather than firepower. Mayer studied the Boeing's defensive armament the way Kartveli studied structural failure modes, systematically without sentiment, and identified the one approach vector where the Fortress's 13 machine guns converged least effectively: dead ahead. 12 o'clock high, closing at a combined speed north of 600 miles per hour, the attacking fighter presented a near-zero deflection target to the bomber's gunners for roughly 2 seconds. 2 seconds of exposure against a frontal aspect so narrow that the .50 caliber rounds had almost no crossing angle to work with. Mayer drilled his pilots on the approach until they could hold course through the B-17's prop wash, firing the MG-151s and the Mk-108 30mm cannon in a burst window of about 1.5 seconds before braking hard underneath the formation. The results transformed the air war over France. JG-2's kill rate against heavy bombers tripled between October 1942 and March 1943. 8th Air Force mission planners noticed. They couldn't not notice. Entire squadron boxes came apart under Mayer's frontal attacks, fortresses shedding wings and cockpit sections as the cannon rounds found the one part of the airframe that had no armor, the nose, greenhouse, where the bombardier and navigator sat behind nothing but plexiglass. By March 1944, Mayer's personal score stood at 102 confirmed victories. 25 of those were 4-engine heavy bombers. Each one represented a crew of 10 men, some killed, some captured, some badly burned. The arithmetic is blunt. Mayer alone accounted for the destruction of aircraft carrying 250 American airmen. He held the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, a decoration that placed him in the top fraction of a percent of German combat pilots, and his tactical innovation, the head-on pass, had been adopted across nearly every fighter wing, opposing the 8th Air Force's daylight campaign. Luftwaffe records from JG-2's operations staff describe Mayer in language usually reserved for institutional doctrine, rather than individual pilots. His methods appear in training memoranda, distributed to replacement units as late as January 1944, complete with diagrams showing approach angles, brake timing, optimal firing ranges against the B-17G and the B-24. Keep all of that in mind. A pilot with 102 kills, a quarter of them heavy bombers, requiring precision gunnery against a closing speed that compressed every decision into fractions of a second, turned his weapons on a single Republic P-47 over occupied France. A target roughly 1/5 the size of a B-17, moving faster, maneuvering harder, presenting a fraction of the cross-section that Mayer had spent 2 years learning to destroy. His cannon rounds connected. 21 times they connected, plus 100 or more machine gun strikes, which means Mayer, or whoever flew his wing that day, because the specific attribution remains uncertain in the available records, maintained tracking solutions across multiple firing passes against an evading fighter, hitting with a density that would have dismantled anything else flying in European skies. The gunnery performed exactly as designed. The shells struck where they were aimed, and the Focke-Wulf pilot did nothing wrong. And the Thunderbolt flew home. The German after-action reporting system for air-to-air engagements required gun camera film confirmation matched against observed results. A pilot claiming a kill needed film showing strikes and a witnessed outcome: fire, structural breakup, or a crash observed from altitude. Mayer's wing reported a P-47 damaged, trailing heavy smoke, last seen descending toward the deck. In Luftwaffe accounting, that scored as a probable, not confirmed. The distinction ate at fighter pilots who had spent ammunition and risked collision course attacks for a result that their bureaucracy refused to certify. FMS interrogations conducted after the war with surviving JG. Two pilots reveal a consistent complaint about engagements with P-47s. The phrase that recurs across multiple debriefings, paraphrased from the original German, amounts to this: confirmed hits producing only damage claims rather than kills eroded confidence in the weapons themselves. The pilots began doubting their guns. Their guns worked fine. The target had simply refused the math. The canopy latch on a P-47D measured about 6 inches long. A stamped steel handle connected to a rail mechanism that locked the sliding bubble in either the open or closed position. It required maybe 4 pounds of force to operate. On June 26, 1943, that handle became the most important piece of hardware in Robert S. Johnson's life, and it refused to move. But the mission started before the canopy jammed. Johnson flew with the 61st Fighter Squadron, part of the 56th Fighter Group based at Halesworth, Suffolk, Hub Zemke's outfit, one of the first P-47 groups operational in the European theater. The assignment that morning sent them as bomber escort over northern France, a standard penetration and withdrawal profile that placed the Thunderbolts at roughly 25,000 feet above a scattered layer of cloud. Johnson's element had already turned for home when the Focke-Wulfs found them. The first pass came from 5 o'clock low, a climbing attack that put cannon rounds into the engine cowling and fuselage belly before Johnson registered the tracers. Oil sprayed across the windscreen in a dark, hot film. The R-2800 shuddered, that asymmetric vibration the engineers at East Hartford had quantified during testing. But the propeller kept turning. Johnson pushed the nose down, building speed toward the deck, and reached for the canopy handle to prepare for a bailout. It wouldn't budge. A 20mm round had deformed the canopy rail, warping the track just enough to bind the sliding mechanism in its locked closed position. Johnson pulled harder. Nothing. He braced his feet against the rudder pedals and hauled with both hands. The latch held. He sat trapped inside a cockpit that now smelled of burned oil and cordite, unable to bail out, descending through 20,000 feet with a damaged engine and Focke-Wulf's repositioning behind him. What followed lasted approximately 10 minutes. Multiple FW-190s made repeated firing passes. The exact number remains uncertain, because Johnson's own accounts give slightly different figures across retellings, and no German records matching the engagement minute by minute have surfaced. The consistent elements across every version: cannon and machine gun strikes hitting the fuselage, wings, tail section, and engine cowling from multiple angles. Rounds punching through the fuselage skin behind the cockpit, fragments peppering the armored seatback, the instrument panel taking hits that killed gauges one at a time, oil pressure gone, then manifold pressure, then the artificial horizon cracking and tumbling uselessly. Johnson dove for the deck, trading altitude for speed, while the Focke-Wulf pilots closed to ranges so short he could see the muzzle flashes winking in the wing roots. The detail worth pausing on is the ammunition itself. The Luftwaffe's standard 20mm round by this period carried the Minengeschoss, a thin-walled, high-explosive shell developed by the Rheinmetall-Borsig engineers specifically to maximize blast effect against aircraft aluminum. The casing used, drawn steel so thin that the shell held nearly twice the explosive filler of a conventional round of the same caliber. 18 grams of PET NWAX compound packed inside a case wall barely over 1 millimeter thick. Against standard aircraft skin, the 16-gauge aluminum sheeting used on Spitfires, Hurricanes, most bomber fuselages, the Minengeschoss functioned like a tiny grenade, blowing holes the size of a fist and sending razor fragments through internal structures. The design assumed aluminum. It assumed thin skin over hollow stringers. Republic's structural philosophy, those doubled longerons, that overlapping armor, the sheer density of mechanical systems packed between the outer skin and the cockpit, gave the Menengeschoss something it hadn't been optimized for. Depth. The fragments still penetrated the outer skin. They still detonated. But the blast energy dispersed across layers of structure, oil lines, ducting, hydraulic runs, and armor plate before reaching anything that would cause the aircraft to stop flying. Anyway, Johnson crossed the French coast at low altitude, trailing smoke from at least 3 separate wounds in the engine cowling, hydraulic fluid streaming from the belly, fabric control surface coverings shredded on the elevator and rudder. The R-2800 ran rough and hot, cylinders misfiring in a sequence that sent vibration patterns through the airframe strong enough to blur his vision. He crossed the channel at under 1,000 feet, unable to climb, unable to bail out, holding heading for the English coast by compass and by the position of the afternoon sun through an oil-smeared windscreen. The Focke-Wulfs had broken off over the coast. They'd spent their ammunition, all of it, somewhere over the Somme estuary, altitude bleeding through 2,000 feet and dropping. The FW-190 pulled alongside, not behind, alongside. Close enough that Johnson could see the pilot's head turned toward him, studying the Thunderbolt the way a mechanic studies an engine that won't quit, despite every reason it should. The German held formation for what Johnson later described as several seconds, long enough to register the leather helmet, the oxygen mask dangling loose below the chin, the dark visor pushed up onto the forehead. Then the Focke-Wulf slid back and behind, and the 20th millimeter rounds started hitting again. This pass came from directly astern, maybe 200 yards, closing to a distance so short that the muzzle flashes and the impacts felt nearly simultaneous. A shell fragment sliced across the back of Johnson's left hand, opening the skin from the base of the thumb to the wrist in a cut that bled freely onto the throttle quadrant. Another burst sent fragments through the cockpit that nicked the bridge of his nose. A shallow wound, almost trivial in isolation, but it bled into his eyes and mixed with the oil already smearing his goggles until forward visibility dropped to almost nothing. He flew by the attitude of the horizon through the side panel, squinting through a gap he'd rubbed clean with his sleeve. 2 7.92 millimeter rounds, standard rifle caliber ammunition from the FW-190's cowl guns, entered his right leg below the knee. The rounds carried enough velocity to penetrate the flight suit and embed in the muscle tissue, but not enough to shatter bone. Johnson felt the impacts as 2 hard punches, sharp heat, followed by a spreading numbness that made the right rudder pedal feel distant and imprecise. The Focke-Wulf made another pass, strikes stitched across the horizontal stabilizer, punching holes through the elevator skin and severing at least one control cable. Johnson felt the stick go slack in the aft direction, then partially recover as the remaining cable took the load at reduced authority. The airplane wanted to nose down. Holding level flight required constant forward stick pressure, which meant gripping with a hand that had a 4-inch laceration bleeding through the glove. The cockpit by this point looked like something from a salvage yard. Holes in the floor panels let daylight through from below. The radio had taken a direct hit and hung from its mount by wiring. Shattered plexiglass from the gunsight housing covered the instrument panel, combing in a glittering layer that crunched under Johnson's forearms every time he moved the stick. The temperature inside the cockpit had climbed throughout the engagement. Waste heat from the laboring engine radiating through the firewall, mixed with the metallic warmth of hydraulic fluid pooling under the seat and the copper smell of his own blood on the throttle grip. His right boot felt heavy and wet. The canopy, still jammed shut, trapped all of it, the smoke, the heat, the oil vapor, in a space roughly 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall. Then the shooting stopped. The FW-190 pulled alongside one more time. Same position, same distance, close enough to count the exhaust stains on the cowling. The German pilot looked across at the Thunderbolt again. Johnson could see him clearly through the side panel, the only section of canopy still transparent. The Focke-Wulf sat there for a long moment, engine throttled back to match the Thunderbolt's reduced speed, and then the German rocked his wings once and pulled away in a climbing turn to the south, back toward France, back toward the grass at Beaumont-le-Roger, or wherever his fuel state allowed him to land. He had nothing left to shoot. Gun camera analysis and post-flight inspection of Johnson's aircraft confirmed the arithmetic. 21 20mm cannon strikes, over 107.92 hits. The Focke-Wulf's ammunition bins held 120 rounds per MG 151 cannon and 900 rounds per MG 17 machine gun. The German had functionally emptied his weapons into a single target over the course of an engagement lasting roughly 10 to 12 minutes across occupied France and the Channel coast. Standard Luftwaffe gunnery doctrine allocated 15 to 20 rounds of 20mm per kill against single-engine fighters. Mayer's pilot. If it carried Mayer's wing markings, if the identification holds across the uncertain sourcing, expended 6 to 8 times the doctrinal ammunition requirement against one P-47. Johnson landed at Manston, the emergency strip on the Kent coast. He did not use the runway. He put the Thunderbolt onto the grass beside it, ground looping to a stop because the brakes had no hydraulic pressure left to operate them. 237. That's where the ground crew at Halesworth stopped counting individual holes in the airframe and started measuring damage by zone instead. Crew Chief Staff Sergeant James O'Brien. Some sources give a different crew chief name, so the specific attribution carries uncertainty. Walked the aircraft twice before he believed it had flown across the channel, rather than been towed in off a gunnery range. The maintenance log for Johnson's P-47, serial number 416228, runs to 3 handwritten pages. Most aircraft damage reports fit on a single form. This one required continuation sheets, and the handwriting deteriorates toward the bottom of the 3rd page as if the man filling it out had grown tired of cataloging destruction. The R-2800 sat in its mounts leaking oil from 7 distinct puncture points in the crankcase and accessory section. 3 cylinders had visible battle damage. The number 14 rocker box penetration already described, plus a cracked barrel on cylinder number 6 and a cooling fin cluster on number 11, reduced to jagged stubs that looked like broken teeth. The propeller blades carried dents and gouges from fragment impacts, one deep enough to require blade replacement, even if the engine had been salvageable. It wasn't. The entire power plant went to the scrap bin. 18 cylinders, the reduction gear housing, the supercharger assembly, all of it written off as beyond economical repair. Pratt & Whitney's inspection criteria allowed field repair of crankcase cracks up to 4 inches in length. Johnson's engine had 3 cracks exceeding that limit on the front case section alone. The turbo supercharger ducting running beneath the fuselage had taken at least 4 direct hits, and the intercooler assembly behind the cockpit had a 20mm entry hole that had allowed pressurized air to bleed into the fuselage interior throughout the flight home, which partially explains why the cockpit temperature climbed so aggressively during the engagement. Hot compressed air from the turbo system, intended to reach the carburetor at controlled temperature, instead vented directly into the space where Johnson sat bleeding. The fact that this didn't cause a fire sits somewhere between engineering margin and dumb luck, and the maintenance report doesn't speculate on which. The control cables were worse. Republic designed the P-47 with dual redundant elevator cables running along opposite sides of the fuselage interior, separated laterally by the full width of the airframe. A single hit couldn't sever both. Every drop of fluid had drained through punctured lines, leaving the wheel brakes, the landing gear retraction system, and the flap actuators completely inert. Johnson lowered the gear using the emergency CO2 blowdown bottle, a backup system that used compressed carbon dioxide to force the gear legs down and locked through a separate set of actuators independent of the main hydraulic circuit. Another redundancy. Another system that existed because someone at Farmingdale had asked what happens when the primary fails, and then built the answer into the airframe at a cost of 11 pounds of additional weight. The ground crew pulled Johnson from the cockpit through the side panel. The canopy still wouldn't open. They had to remove the entire plexiglass assembly from the outside, unbolting the rail from the longerons, because the warp track had seized so completely that no amount of force applied from inside or outside would free the sliding mechanism. Johnson climbed out with blood-dried brown on his left glove, his right trouser leg stiff below the knee, and a headache from oil vapor inhalation that persisted for 2 days afterward. The flight surgeon extracted two 7.92mm bullet fragments from his calf muscle, cleaned the lacerations on his hand and nose, and cleared him for flight status within 72 hours. Republic shipped a replacement P-47 to Halesworth. Johnson flew it on his next mission. The old airframe sat on the field for 3 days while intelligence officers photographed every hole. Then a salvage team stripped it for any components worth recovering. They found remarkably few. The salvage report for serial number 416228 fills a single page, shorter than the damage assessment by 2 full sheets, because writing off an entire airframe requires less paperwork than trying to fix one. Total components recovered for reuse: 6. 2 magnetos, a voltage regulator, the compass, 1 tire, and the tail wheel assembly. Everything else went to the aluminum reclamation pile. Republic Aviation had spent roughly $83,000 and approximately 55,000 man-hours building that aircraft in Farmingdale. The Luftwaffe converted it to scrap metal in 12 minutes over the Somme. Johnson reported to the flight surgeon at Halesworth on June 28, 2 days after Manston. The calf wounds had closed cleanly. The 7.92 fragments sat in a kidney dish on the surgeon's desk, 2 misshapen lumps of copper-jacketed lead, each weighing about 12 grams. The hand laceration required 8 stitches and a compression bandage that Johnson later described as more annoying than the wound itself because the gauze bunched inside his flight glove and made the throttle grip feel wrong. He flew his next combat sortie on June 30th. 4 days. 4 days between absorbing more 20mm cannon fire than any single-engine fighter in the European theater had survived to that point, and climbing back into an identical cockpit with an identical canopy latch and identical 6-inch handle, this one functioning normally, sliding on undamaged rails, 4 pounds of force, open or closed at will. I think about that handle more than any other detail in the file. The engineering kept him alive. The handle nearly killed him. Republic could armor the belly, double the control cables, pack the fuselage with redundant hydraulics, and none of it mattered if one stamped steel latch jammed at the wrong moment. Johnson couldn't bail out, so he survived. He finished the war with 27 confirmed aerial victories, tying Eddie Rickenbacker's First World War record and making Johnson the leading American ace in the European theater by the time he rotated home in 1944. 27. Every one of them scored in the same type of aircraft that had refused to die over the Somme. He never transitioned to the P-51. Hub Zemke's 56th Fighter Group stayed with the Thunderbolt through the end of the war, and their kill ratio against the Luftwaffe ran higher than any Mustang group in 8th Fighter Command. That statistic irritates certain aviation historians who prefer the Mustang narrative, but the numbers from the 8th Air Force victory credits don't bend to preference. The Luftwaffe never wrote a formal assessment of why the P-47 absorbed punishment the way it did. Neither FMS reports nor Trent Park transcripts address the question directly. No captured general marveled at the Thunderbolt's structural resilience in the specific terms an engineer would use. What exists instead sits scattered across operational reports and unit diaries from JG-2 and JG-26, repeated references to the Donnerkiel, requiring excessive ammunition expenditure to bring down, complaints about the number of rounds wasted on targets that refused to burn or break apart, requests for heavier armament that Berlin couldn't fulfill because the production lines had no capacity left. The word verschwendung, waste, appears in at least 2 JG-2 operational summaries from the summer of 1943, applied not to ammunition policy, but to the specific tactical problem of engaging P-47s with weapons calibrated for thinner aircraft. They solved the B-17 problem. Mayer's head-on attack became standard doctrine across the Western fighter force within months, but the Thunderbolt didn't fly in formation. It didn't hold straight and level at 25,000 feet, waiting to be intercepted on a predictable heading. The aircraft dove, ran, absorbed the hits that would have killed a Spitfire 3 times over, and came back across the channel trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid and oil, and 3 days later, a replacement sat on the same hardstand, with the same unit markings and a fresh engine and full ammunition bins. Mayer himself fell in combat on March 2, 1944, killed during a head-on pass against American fighters over Montmedy. The encounter report doesn't specify what type of American aircraft fired the shots. Johnson's scrapped Thunderbolt sat in the reclamation yard at Halesworth for 11 days before a truck hauled the aluminum to a smelting facility in the Midlands. By August, that metal had likely re-entered the British aircraft production pipeline, possibly as Spitfire skin, 16-gauge aluminum sheeting, thin over hollow stringers, exactly the kind of structure the Minengeschoss had been built to destroy. Robert Johnson stepped out of the cockpit for the last time in November 1944, rotated home with 27 kills and a body that still carried scar tissue from the Somme engagement 16 months earlier. The left hand flexed stiffly in cold weather, where the laceration had healed tight, and the right calf ached on long walks, where the 7.92 fragments had left pockets of fibrous tissue deep in the muscle. He went home to Lawton, Oklahoma. Behind him, the P-47 kept flying. Republic built 15,683 of them before the lines shut down, more than any other American fighter in history. The Thunderbolt flew more combat sorties in the European theater than the P-51, the P-38, and the P-40 combined. 546,000 sorties by war's end across all theaters. Its loss rate per sortie in the ETO ran lower than every other single-engine fighter the Army Air Forces fielded, a statistic buried in the Army Air Force's Statistical Digest of 1945 that nobody at the time thought to celebrate because the Mustang had better publicity and longer legs. The R-2800 didn't care about publicity. Pratt Whitney produced the engine in 2 plants, East Hartford, Connecticut, and a second facility in Kansas City, Missouri, at a combined peak rate exceeding 4,000 units per month by mid-1944. 4,000. Hand-fitted at 18 critical tolerance points, test run for 4 hours on a dynamometer before crating, every unit capable of producing 2,100 horsepower in war emergency with water methanol injection activated. The Germans had nothing equivalent. The BMW 801, radial in the FW190, produced 1,600 horsepower in its best variants and ran rough above that threshold. The Junkers Jumo 213, a promising inline, never reached mass production in time to matter. Verschwendung, waste, applied to more than ammunition. It applied to the entire German strategic position against an industrial base that could absorb the loss of a complete airframe on Tuesday and replace it by Friday with a machine built to identical specifications, carrying an engine stamped from the same tooling on the same production line by workers who had done it 4,000 times that month. The Luftwaffe's operational summaries from late 1943 through early 1944 read like a man describing the tide coming in. JG2's strength returns show a unit bleeding pilots faster than Ergänzungsgruppen could train replacements, burning through FW190 airframes at rates that exceeded monthly allocation, requesting transfer to the Eastern Front, where at least the Soviet fighters had the decency to catch fire when hit. One JG-26 diarist described the American escort fighters over France as a problem without a solution. Not those exact words, but the operational language carries that weight across translation. The Thunderbolt had arrived fat, ugly, and nearly indestructible, and no amount of Teutonic gunnery doctrine could change the arithmetic of an engine with 18 cylinders and an airframe designed by a man who assumed everything would get shot. Egon Mayer died at 36, killed over Montmedy on March 2, 1944. 9 months after his unit's ammunition had been wasted against Johnson's Thunderbolt. Hub Zemke survived the war, but lost his command in October 1944 when turbulence broke apart his P-51 over Germany, and he parachuted into captivity. Alexander Kartveli never stopped designing. He led Republic's engineering division through the F-84 Thunderjet and the F-105 Thunderchief, building jets the same way he'd built the P-47, heavy, fast, packed with redundancy that test pilots complained about until the day it saved them. He died in 1974 in New York, still holding patents on aircraft structures. Johnson left the Air Force after the war, took a job as a test pilot and technical representative for Republic Aviation at Farmingdale, the factory floor where serial number 416228 had been assembled, the building where someone had stamped out that canopy latch. 20,000 workers in that complex had turned aluminum sheet and Pratt Whitney iron into the airplane the Luftwaffe couldn't kill. He worked there for decades, demonstrating the aircraft he'd bled inside to foreign buyers and Air Force procurement officers, walking the assembly line where Thunderbolts had rolled out at rates Berlin couldn't match and Tokyo couldn't comprehend. Johnson lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, flew light aircraft into his 70s, and died in December 2006 at age 87, 63 years after a German pilot emptied every round he carried into Johnson's airplane and watched it fly home anyway.